It was Christmas time in Winter Hollow, a small, postcard-perfect town nestled in the hills of Vermont. The town was famous for its lavish holiday celebrations, where every street glowed with twinkling lights and garlands hung from every lamppost. The annual Festival of Lights was in full swing, and the air was filled with the scent of roasted chestnuts and evergreen boughs. The townsfolk bustled about, their laughter mingling with the sound of carolers singing on street corners. Edward Hayes walked the streets alone, his tailored coat doing little to shield him from the biting cold. A self-made millionaire, Edward had everything a man could want. At least, that's what people thought. In truth, this was the first Christmas he would spend without his daughter, Emma. The tragic accident that had claimed her life earlier that year had left Edward hollow inside, his once boundless ambition now replaced with a deep sense of loss. Christmas, once a season of joy for him, now felt like a cruel reminder of all he had lost. He passed by shop windows decorated with glistening ornaments and families laughing together, but none of it touched him. He was on his way home from a charity gala, an event he had attended more out of obligation than any genuine desire to help. His driver waited nearby, but Edward found himself wandering instead, aimlessly drawn to the heart of the town's celebrations. As he crossed the main square, his eyes caught sight of a small, makeshift stall. It was decorated with scraps of tinsel and a handwritten sign that read, "Handmade Christmas ornaments, 50 cents each." Behind the stall sat a girl no older than 11, bundled in a worn coat that looked 2 sizes too big. Her face was pale, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She was wiping her eyes, though she tried to hide her tears from passers-by. Edward paused. There was something about her, something that stopped him in his tracks. He didn't understand it at first, but as he studied her, a strange feeling came over him. She reminded him of Emma at that age. The resemblance was uncanny. The same wide eyes, the same determined set to her small chin. "Why are you crying?" he asked, his voice softer than he'd intended. The girl looked up, startled. She quickly wiped her face with her sleeve and said, "I'm not crying. I'm just cold." Edward didn't believe her, but decided not to press. "What's your name?" "Lila," she replied. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled as she adjusted one of the ornaments on the table. It was a little angel made of paper and bits of old ribbon, its wings slightly lopsided. Edward reached for it. "Did you make this?" Lila nodded. "I made all of them." He studied the angel for a moment, then pulled out his wallet. "I'll take it." But when he handed her a crisp $20 bill, she shook her head. "I don't need charity. If you want it, it's 50 cents. Edward was taken aback by her pride, but found himself respecting it. He pulled out a quarter and 2 dimes, handing them to her. She accepted the money and carefully placed the angel in a small paper bag. "Why are you out here so late, Lila?" he asked. "Shouldn't you be home?" "I'm trying to sell enough ornaments to buy something for my sister," she said simply. "It's Christmas Eve, and I promised her." "Where are your parents?" The question escaped him before he could think better of it. "They're gone," Lila said, her voice flat but devoid of self-pity. "It's just me and Rosie now." Edward felt a pang of guilt for asking, but couldn't shake the sense that there was more to her story. He watched as she adjusted the sign on her stall, trying to make it stand out more. Few people stopped to look, their attention focused on the larger, more polished displays nearby. "Tell you what," Edward said after a pause. "I'll buy the rest of your ornaments." Her eyes widened. "Why would you do that?" "Let's just say I could use some Christmas spirit," he replied, though the answer felt incomplete even to him. Lila hesitated, her pride warring with the need to keep her promise to her sister. Finally, she nodded. As she packed up the rest of the ornaments, Edward noticed her hands were red and chapped from the cold. Before he left, she looked up at him, studying his face as if searching for something. "You remind me of someone," she said suddenly. "Oh?" Edward asked, startled. "My mom. You have her eyes." The words hit Edward like a thunderclap, but before he could respond, she turned away to finish packing her stall. He stood there for a moment, stunned, before tucking the small bag with the angel into his coat pocket and walking away. Edward couldn't shake the encounter with Lila as he walked back to his car. Her words, "You have her eyes," echoed in his mind. stirring memories he had buried long ago. He hadn't thought about Eleanor in years, but now her face, warm, radiant, and full of life, rose clearly in his mind. She had been the love of his youth, a part of his life before he became consumed by his career. Their romance had ended when he chose ambition over love, leaving her behind in Winter Hollow to chase success in the city. He had always assumed she had moved on, just as he had. But the mention of her felt like a thread pulling at a part of his soul he thought was long gone. As the snow fell softly around him, Edward climbed into his waiting car, clutching the paper bag with the angel ornament. The driver greeted him, but Edward barely registered it. "Take me home," he said, his voice distant. He spent the ride in silence, the angel in his lap, his fingers tracing the edges of its delicate wings. Lila's face, so much like Emma's, lingered in his mind. Could it be possible? He wondered. Could there be a connection between this girl and the life he had left behind? That night, Edward sat alone in his study, the glow of the Christmas tree casting long shadows across the room. He pulled an old photo album from the shelf, one he hadn't opened in years. Inside were faded pictures of his younger self, carefree and smiling, his arm wrapped around Eleanor. She had been his entire world once, and the sight of her now filled him with a pang of regret. On one page, a small, pressed flower fell out, brittle and yellowed with age. It had been Eleanor's favorite, a keepsake from the wild meadows near the edge of town where they used to walk for hours. He closed the album and leaned back in his chair, the angel ornament still sitting on the desk in front of him. The coincidence was too much to ignore. Tomorrow, he decided, he would find Lila again. He had questions he wasn't sure he wanted answers to, but he knew he couldn't let this go. The next morning, Edward returned to the square where he had met Lila. The stall was gone, and the square was quieter now, the festive bustle of Christmas Eve replaced by the stillness of Christmas Day. He walked the streets, searching for any sign of her. After nearly an hour of wandering, he stopped at a small cafe for coffee, feeling a strange mix of disappointment and determination. "Looking for someone?" asked the barista, a friendly older woman who seemed to know everyone in town. Edward hesitated, then nodded. A girl, about 11 years old. She was selling ornaments here last night. The barista's brow furrowed. "Ah, you must mean Lila. Sweet girl. She comes in here sometimes to warm up with a cup of cocoa. Lives down on Maple Street, near the old mill." "Thank you," Edward said, leaving a generous tip before heading out. The address she gave him was in one of the poorer parts of town, an area Edward hadn't set foot in for decades. As he approached, the picturesque charm of Winter Hollow gave way to peeling paint and cracked sidewalks. He found the building easily. It was small and run down, with a sagging porch and a dim light in the window. Edward knocked, his heart pounding. For a moment, there was no response, and he began to wonder if he had made a mistake. But then the door creaked open, and there stood Lila, looking up at him with wide eyes. "You came back," she said, surprised but not unhappy. "I wanted to see you again," Edward said. "May I come in?" Lila hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. "Rosie's sleeping," she said, her voice soft. "But okay." She stepped aside, and Edward entered the small apartment. The space was cramped but tidy, with makeshift holiday decorations strung across the room. In one corner, a little girl, no more than 5 or 6, was curled up on a worn couch, wrapped in a threadbare blanket. Lila gestured for Edward to sit at the tiny kitchen table. "I wanted to ask you about your mother," Edward began carefully. "You said something yesterday about me having her eyes. What did you mean by that?" Lila tilted her head, studying him as if trying to decide whether to trust him. Finally, she stood and pulled a small tin box from a shelf. From it, she retrieved a photograph, worn and faded but still clear enough to see. She handed it to Edward, who felt his breath catch as he looked at it. It was Eleanor. She was younger than he remembered, but there was no mistaking her. She stood in front of a small house, smiling, a baby in her arms. "That's my mom," Lila said. "And that's me when I was a baby." Edward's hands trembled as he held the photo. He could barely speak. "Your mother, Eleanor. He stopped, his voice breaking. "She died when I was 5. Lila said quietly. She got sick. It's just been me and Rosie since then. Edward's chest tightened as the weight of her words sank in. Eleanor was gone. The woman he had loved, the woman who might have been the mother of his child, was gone. And yet here was Lila, a living, breathing connection to the past he thought he'd left behind. He looked at her, his eyes filling with tears. Lila, I think I might be your father. Lila stared at him, her face a mixture of shock and confusion. What? Edward reached across the table, taking her hands in his. I don't know for sure, but I knew your mother a long time ago. I loved her, and when I look at you, I see her. I see Emma, my daughter. I see family. For the first time, Lila's tough exterior cracked, and tears welled up in her eyes. She pulled her hands away, hugging herself tightly. You can't just come here and say that, she whispered. You don't know what it's been like. Edward's voice softened. You're right. I don't. But I want to. I want to know you. And Rosie, I want to make things right, if you'll let me. Lila didn't answer, but for a moment, Edward thought he saw a glimmer of hope in her tear-filled eyes. Lila didn't say anything for a long time. She sat at the small table, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her gaze fixed on the floor. Edward wanted to say more, to fill the silence with assurances and promises, but he knew this moment wasn't about him. It was about her. He could see how much she was struggling to process what he had just told her, and he didn't want to push her away by speaking too soon. I don't know what to think, Lila finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. You say you might be my dad, but where were you all this time? Why didn't you come for us before? The question hit Edward like a blow. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and ran a hand over his face. I didn't know, Lila, he said softly. If I had known, things would have been different. Your mother and I, we loved each other a long time ago, but I left Winter Hollow. I thought she had moved on, that her life had taken a different path. I never imagined. His voice trailed off as he looked back at her. I never imagined you existed. Lila's expression softened slightly, but her guard didn't drop entirely. Mom never talked about you much, she admitted. She just said there was someone she loved, but he wasn't around anymore. She always seemed sad when she talked about it, so I stopped asking questions. Edward felt a lump form in his throat. The thought of Eleanor carrying that sadness for years, raising Lila and later Rosie on her own, was almost too much to bear. Your mother was an incredible woman, he said. And if I failed her, if I failed you, I'm sorry. Lila didn't respond immediately, but she didn't pull away when Edward reached out and placed a hand over hers. For a brief moment, a fragile connection formed between them, one that felt as though it could either break or grow stronger with time. Before either of them could say more, a soft whimper came from the couch. Rosie was stirring, her small form shifting under the blanket. Lila quickly got up and went to her, brushing a hand gently over her sister's forehead. It's okay, Rosie. Go back to sleep. The little girl blinked sleepily, her big brown eyes focusing on Edward. Who's that? She asked in a small, curious voice. Edward smiled gently. I'm a friend of your sister's, he said, not wanting to overwhelm the child with too much information. Rosie sat up slightly, still clutching the blanket. Did you bring presents? She asked, her voice tinged with the innocent hope of a child on Christmas. Edward hesitated, but Lila stepped in. Not yet, she said, glancing at Edward. But maybe he can help us get some breakfast. The suggestion felt like a lifeline, a chance to move forward, however tentatively. Edward nodded. I'd be happy to. Let me take you both somewhere warm where we can eat. My treat. Lila looked uncertain, but Rosie's face lit up at the mention of food. Can we get pancakes? She asked excitedly. Lila sighed, then gave a small nod. Okay, but just breakfast. Edward smiled, sensing a small victory. He helped Lila bundle Rosie up in her coat and hat before they headed out together. The walk to the diner was short, but the icy air made Rosie shiver, and Edward instinctively wrapped his scarf around her shoulders. She looked up at him with wide eyes but didn't protest. The diner was bustling with activity, filled with families and the smell of fresh coffee and syrup. Edward guided Lila and Rosie to a booth near the window, where they could watch the snow falling softly outside. The waitress greeted them warmly and took their orders, her eyes lingering on Lila and Rosie with a mix of curiosity and kindness. As they waited for their food, Edward couldn't help but notice how protective Lila was of her sister. She kept a close eye on Rosie, helping her unwrap her utensils and carefully pouring syrup on her pancakes when they arrived. It was clear that Lila had taken on a caretaker role far beyond her years, and Edward's heart ached to think of how much responsibility she had been forced to bear. "You're a good sister," he said quietly, not wanting to embarrass her but feeling the need to acknowledge it. Lila glanced at him, her expression guarded. "Someone has to be," she said simply. Edward nodded, deciding not to press the point. Instead, he turned his attention to Rosie, who was happily eating her pancakes. "These must be the best pancakes in town," he said with a smile. Rosie giggled. "They're so good. We don't usually get to eat out like this." Edward's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Well, maybe we can make it a tradition," he said. "Christmas pancakes every year." Lila looked at him sharply, her eyes narrowing. "You can't just show up and start talking about traditions," she said, her voice low but firm. "You don't even know us." Edward held up his hands in a gesture of surrender. "You're right," he said. "I don't know you, not yet, but I'd like to. If you'll let me." Lila didn't respond immediately, but the tension in her shoulders seemed to ease slightly. She looked down at her plate, her fork pushing a piece of pancake back and forth. "I don't know if we can trust you," she said finally. "What if you leave, like everyone else?" Edward's chest tightened at her words. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice steady. "I promise you that." Lila looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of dishonesty. For a moment, Edward felt as though the weight of her entire world rested on whether she believed him or not. Finally, she gave a small nod, and though it was barely perceptible, it was enough. It was a start. They finished their breakfast in relative silence, but the atmosphere was less tense now. Rosie chatted happily, filling the quiet with stories about her favorite Christmas movies and her dreams of what Santa might bring her. Edward listened intently, soaking in every detail, while Lila watched him carefully, as if waiting to see if his interest was genuine. When they left the diner, the snow had started to fall more heavily, blanketing the streets in white. Edward walked them back to their apartment, the quiet crunch of their footsteps the only sound. As they reached the door, Lila turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Thanks for breakfast," she said. "But I still don't know what to think about all this." Edward nodded. "That's okay," he said gently. "Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." For the first time, Lila's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. It wasn't much, but to Edward, it felt like the beginning of something extraordinary. Edward spent the rest of Christmas Day lost in thought. Back in the quiet of his rented house, he replayed every word and every glance exchanged with Lila. The weight of her guarded expression, the cautious hope in her eyes, and the pure innocence of Rosie's laughter stayed with him, a mix of guilt and longing gnawing at his chest. He had made his intentions clear to Lila, but he knew it would take more than promises to earn her trust. He had to show her, through actions, not words, that he wasn't going to disappear like so many others in her life. The next morning, Edward awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. For years, he had thrown money at causes during the holidays, funding charities and attending galas that gave him the illusion of goodwill. This time, however, the stakes were personal. Lila and Rosie needed more than fleeting generosity. They needed someone who would be there for them, not just for Christmas, but every day after. Edward began by making a few discreet calls. He contacted a trusted private investigator to learn more about Lila's and Rosie's circumstances. He wanted to know everything, how they'd been living, whether there were any relatives who might challenge his role in their lives, and, most importantly, what kind of future they faced without his intervention. He also reached out to a lawyer to explore the possibility of gaining custody, though he knew it was far too soon to discuss that with Lila. As he waited for answers, Edward decided to start smaller. He returned to the town square, where the remnants of the Christmas festivities were being cleaned up. The twinkling lights remained, but the bustling crowds had thinned. Edward visited local shops and quietly gathered supplies, warm coats, sturdy boots, and groceries. He didn't want to overwhelm Lila, but he couldn't bear the thought of her and Rosie going without essentials during the harsh winter. Later that afternoon, Edward returned to their apartment, balancing the bags in his arms as he knocked on the door. This time, it was Rosie who answered, her face lighting up when she saw him. "You came back," she exclaimed, stepping aside to let him in. Lila appeared from the small kitchen, her expression wary as she wiped her hands on a dish towel. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice more curious than accusatory. Edward set the bags down near the door and gestured toward them. "I thought you might need a few things. Coats, boots, some food." Lila frowned, her eyes flicking toward the bags. "We're not a charity case." "I know," Edward said gently. "This isn't charity. It's family helping family." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Edward worried he had pushed too far. But then Rosie, oblivious to the tension, began digging through the bags, pulling out a bright pink coat that made her squeal with delight. "Look, Lila, it's so warm." Lila's shoulders relaxed slightly, though she didn't smile. "You didn't have to do this," she said, her voice softer now. "I wanted to," Edward replied. "And if there's ever anything else you need, all you have to do is tell me." Rosie tugged at Lila's sleeve. "Can we try them on?" "Please," Lila sighed, but there was a hint of affection in her exasperation. "Fine, but only because you need a new coat." As the girls tried on their new winter clothes, Edward took a moment to survey the small apartment. The cracks in the walls and the threadbare furniture spoke volumes about their struggles. He felt an ache in his chest, not just for their current situation, but for the years he hadn't been there to help. He had no right to expect forgiveness, but he was determined to earn it anyway. Later, as they sat together around the small kitchen table, Edward tried to learn more about their lives. Rosie, ever the chatterbox, happily filled the silence with stories about school and her favorite books. Lila, however, remained quieter, her eyes flicking to Edward now and then as if trying to read his intentions. "What do you do?" she asked suddenly, cutting through Rosie's excited rambling. Edward set down his coffee cup and smiled faintly. "I run a company. We build things. Homes, offices, places where people can live and work." Lila nodded slowly. "Is that why you left? To build things?" Edward's smile faded. He considered his words carefully before answering. "I left because I thought that's what I was supposed to do. I wanted to be successful, to make something of myself. But looking back, I realize I left behind the things that really mattered." Lila didn't respond, but the way her gaze softened told Edward she was listening, even if she wasn't ready to say so. As the afternoon wore on, Edward noticed Lila starting to lower her guard, if only slightly. When Rosie suggested they all play a board game she had tucked away in the corner, Lila didn't protest. Edward joined in, surprising even himself with how easily laughter came to him as Rosie gleefully explained the rules. For the first time in years, Edward felt a flicker of something he had thought he'd lost forever. Hope. It was fragile, like a candle flame flickering in the wind, but it was there, warming him in a way that wealth and success never had. When it was time for him to leave, Edward stood at the door, unsure of how to say goodbye. "I'll see you again soon," he said, looking at Lila. "If that's okay." Lila hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." As Edward stepped out into the cold evening air, he felt an unfamiliar lightness in his chest. He knew there was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, he believed it was a road worth traveling. For Lila, for Rosie, for the chance to finally become the man he should have been all along. The days that followed were filled with small but meaningful steps toward building something Edward hoped could one day resemble a family. He made a habit of visiting Lila and Rosie every couple of days, never arriving empty-handed but always careful not to overwhelm them. Sometimes he brought groceries or small treats for Rosie, like the coloring books she adored. Other times, it was nothing more than himself, eager to listen and learn about the two young girls who had unexpectedly become the center of his world. At first, Lila's skepticism lingered, her guarded demeanor firmly in place. She remained polite but distant, as if waiting for the moment Edward's promises would prove empty. Rosie, on the other hand, grew increasingly attached, her natural warmth and curiosity bridging the gap that her sister's caution kept in place. Edward found himself cherishing the little girl's laughter and endless chatter, which filled the quiet apartment with a kind of joy he hadn't realized he was missing. One evening, as snow fell thickly outside their apartment window, Edward brought over a small box filled with ornaments and a modest artificial tree. He didn't want to assume too much, but he had noticed the absence of holiday decorations in their home and thought it might brighten their space. "Christmas is over," Lila said when she saw the box, her tone skeptical but not unkind. "I know," Edward said, smiling, "but I thought we could have one last celebration. Just us." Rosie clapped her hands excitedly. "Can we decorate it, Lila? Please." Lila hesitated, glancing between Edward and her sister. Finally, with a small sigh, she nodded. "Okay." Together, they set up the tree in the corner of the living room. Rosie eagerly unwrapped each ornament, her face lighting up at the colorful baubles and delicate strands of tinsel. Edward showed her how to hang them, lifting her so she could reach the higher branches. Lila worked more quietly, adding ornaments here and there while stealing glances at Edward. She seemed to be studying him, still searching for cracks in his sincerity. When the tree was fully decorated, Edward plugged in the lights, and the room was suddenly filled with a warm, golden glow. Rosie gasped, clapping her hands in delight. "It's so pretty." "It is," Edward agreed, his voice soft. He looked at Lila, who was staring at the tree with an expression that was hard to read. "What do you think?" Lila shrugged, but there was a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "It's nice." They sat together for a while, admiring their handiwork. Edward told them stories about the Christmases he used to spend with his daughter, Emma, when she was Rosie's age. He spoke carefully, aware that his memories might stir complicated emotions in Lila. But instead of growing distant, she listened intently, her eyes fixed on him as if trying to understand the man behind the stories. "Did Emma like Christmas?" she asked suddenly. Edward nodded. She loved it, especially decorating the tree. She used to insist on putting the star on top, even when she was too little to reach. "I'd have to lift her up every year." Rosie giggled. "I'd like to do that too." Lila glanced at her sister, her expression softening. "Maybe next year." Edward's heart swelled at her words. It was the first time Lila had mentioned the possibility of a future that included him. It was a small step, but it felt monumental. As the night wore on, Rosie grew sleepy, her small form curling up on the couch beneath a blanket. Edward stayed a little longer, talking quietly with Lila while Rosie dozed. He asked her about school, about her dreams, about the things she and Rosie liked to do together. At first, her answers were short and cautious, but gradually she began to open up, sharing small glimpses of their life before their mother passed away. "She used to sing to us," Lila said, her voice soft, "every night before bed. Rosie doesn't remember, but I do. It was always the same song." Edward hesitated, unsure if he should ask the question that was on his mind. "Do you miss her?" Lila's gaze dropped to her lap. "Every day." Edward nodded, his chest tightening. "I miss her too," he said quietly. "I didn't get to know her the way I should have, but she gave the world two amazing girls. And for that, I'll always be grateful." Lila didn't respond, but her eyes glistened, and Edward could tell his words had reached her. Before he left that night, Edward pulled a small envelope from his coat pocket and handed it to Lila. "This is for you," he said. "It's not much, but I thought you might like it." Lila opened the envelope carefully, revealing 2 tickets to a children's matinee at the local theater. "Rosie's been asking about the Christmas play," Edward explained. "I thought it might be something fun for you to do together." Lila stared at the tickets for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. Edward met her gaze, his eyes filled with sincerity. "Because you deserve it. Both of you. And because I want to be here for you, not just now, but for as long as you'll let me." Lila looked away, her fingers tightening around the envelope. She didn't say anything, but Edward saw the faintest flicker of something in her eyes. Maybe trust, maybe hope. It was fleeting, but it was enough to remind him why he was here. As he stepped out into the cold night air, Edward felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He was still a long way from earning Lila's full trust, but he was beginning to believe that it was possible. For the first time in a long time, the future felt bright. Over the following weeks, Edward began to carve out a steady place in Lila and Rosie's lives. The visits became a routine, as natural as the snow falling over Winter Hollow, and with each one, the bond between them grew a little stronger. Rosie's enthusiasm was immediate and unrestrained. She treated Edward as though he'd always been part of their world, chatting endlessly and tugging on his hand to show him her latest drawings or favorite toys. Lila, however, remained more reserved. She engaged with him cautiously, as if testing whether his presence would truly last, or if he would vanish like so many other fleeting promises in her life. Edward respected her pace. He didn't press or push, but instead let his actions speak louder than words. On the days he visited, he brought small comforts, ingredients for dinner, a warm blanket he thought would brighten their couch, or a board game they could all play together. He spent hours fixing things around the apartment, the squeaky cabinet door, the dripping faucet in the bathroom, and the broken heater that had barely kept the girls warm through the coldest nights. He approached each task with quiet determination, knowing that every small effort mattered. It wasn't just the practical help that started to soften Lila's walls. Edward listened, really listened, to her. He paid attention when she spoke, whether it was a small comment about school or a rare mention of her mother. Slowly, she began to let her guard down, offering glimpses into the life she'd had before everything changed. She talked about the songs her mother used to sing, the stories they would make up together, and the nights they spent dreaming about a future that felt so far away now. One evening, as Edward sat at their kitchen table watching Rosie color, Lila spoke up from where she was folding laundry. "Mom used to say Christmas was magic," she said, her tone contemplative, "that no matter how hard things were, it was a time to believe in something good." Edward nodded thoughtfully. "Your mom was a wise woman." Lila hesitated, then looked at him directly. "Do you believe that? In Christmas magic?" Edward smiled faintly, the weight of his own losses reflected in his eyes. "I didn't. Not for a long time. But meeting you and Rosie, it's starting to feel like maybe your mom was right." The words hung between them, and for the first time, Lila didn't look away. Instead, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if accepting his answer. The breakthrough came a week later. Edward had been in contact with the private investigator he'd hired, who had finally pieced together Eleanor's story. Edward learned how she had worked tirelessly to provide for Lila after his departure, juggling multiple jobs while shielding her daughter from the struggles they faced. He also discovered that, shortly before her illness took hold, Eleanor had written a series of letters addressed to him. Letters she had never sent. The investigator had found them tucked away in a box at the shelter where Eleanor had once sought help, unopened and unsent, her fears of disrupting Edward's life outweighing her own need to reconnect. Edward was overcome with emotion as he read the letters. They were filled with warmth, regret, and hope. Eleanor hadn't wanted to burden him, but had always hoped that one day he might find his way back to Winter Hollow, to the family he hadn't known he had. Among the letters was a photo of Eleanor and a young Lila, no more than 3 years old, standing in front of a Christmas tree. Lila was grinning, her small hands clutching a paper angel ornament that looked remarkably familiar. The discovery deepened Edward's resolve. He shared the letters with Lila, unsure how she would react. To his surprise, she didn't push them away. Instead, she sat quietly at the kitchen table, reading through each one with a mix of longing and grief. Rosie was too young to understand the significance, but Lila seemed to grasp the depth of what her mother had left behind. "She wanted you to know," Lila said after a long silence, her voice trembling slightly. "Even if she couldn't tell you herself." Edward reached across the table and placed a hand over hers. "And now that I do, I promise I'm not going anywhere. I'm here for you and Rosie, for as long as you'll let me be." Lila didn't pull her hand away this time. Instead, she nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Okay," she whispered. In the days that followed, Edward began to take more concrete steps toward building a future for Lila and Rosie. He reached out to a lawyer to begin the process of formalizing his role in their lives, ensuring that they would have stability and security no matter what. He also made arrangements to move them out of their cramped apartment into a house in Winter Hollow, one that was warm and filled with light, a place where they could start fresh together. The move itself was a day filled with excitement and nerves. Rosie was thrilled, racing from room to room and marveling at the space they now had. Lila was more subdued, her emotions carefully guarded as always, but Edward noticed the way her eyes lit up when she saw the small room he had prepared for her. It was simple but filled with thoughtful touches: a cozy bed, a bookshelf for the few books she had mentioned loving, and in the corner, a desk where she could do her homework. "You didn't have to do all this," Lila said softly as she stood in the doorway of her new room. "I wanted to," Edward replied. "You deserve it." She turned to face him, her expression conflicted. "It's just a lot. I'm not used to people staying or caring." Edward crouched down, so they were at eye level. "I know it's going to take time," he said gently, "but I'm here, Lila. I'm not leaving. Not now, not ever." For the first time, her defenses fully cracked. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him in a hesitant hug. Edward froze for a moment, overwhelmed by the sudden display of trust, before he hugged her back, his heart swelling with emotion. That night, as the first fire crackled in the new home's fireplace, Edward, Lila, and Rosie sat together on the couch, wrapped in blankets and drinking hot cocoa. Rosie fell asleep first, her head resting on Edward's lap, while Lila stayed awake, her gaze fixed on the flames. "Do you think she'd be proud of us?" Lila asked quietly. "Your mom?" Edward replied, his voice filled with certainty. "I think she'd be proud of both of you. And I hope someday she'd be proud of me too." Lila didn't say anything, but the small smile that played on her lips spoke volumes. For the first time in years, she felt safe. She felt seen. And though the road ahead would not be without its challenges, she felt, for the first time, that they weren't alone anymore. The weeks turned into months, and the snow began to melt, revealing the first hints of spring in Winter Hollow. For Edward, the time had been transformative. Each day brought new challenges, but also new joys. He had thrown himself completely into his new role in Lila and Rosie's lives, learning to navigate the delicate balance between being present and giving them the space they needed to adjust to their new reality. Rosie, as always, embraced Edward with the unguarded enthusiasm only a child could muster. She was a bright light in every room she entered, her laughter infectious and her curiosity boundless. Lila, on the other hand, continued to approach him with cautious optimism. She was learning to trust, but Edward could see the lingering shadows of her past in her eyes. She had carried the weight of the world on her small shoulders for so long that letting go of that burden didn't come easily. One afternoon, as Edward sat at the kitchen table reviewing paperwork for his company, Lila joined him, her schoolbooks tucked under one arm. She hesitated for a moment before sitting across from him, carefully spreading out her homework. "Need any help?" Edward asked, glancing up from his papers. She shook her head. "I'm fine." He nodded, not wanting to push, but as the minutes ticked by, he noticed her brow furrowing in frustration. Finally, she sighed and shoved the notebook toward him. "I don't get it," she admitted reluctantly. Edward smiled, setting aside his work. "Let's take a look." The two spent the next hour going over her math problems, Edward patiently walking her through each step. It was a simple thing, but to him, it felt monumental. Sitting there with her, offering guidance and encouragement, he felt more like a father than he ever had before. By the time they finished, Lila was smiling. A real smile, not the hesitant, fleeting expressions he had seen before. "Thanks," she said, her voice soft but genuine. "You're a smart kid," Edward replied. "You just needed a little boost." Her smile lingered, and for the first time, she didn't immediately retreat to her room after they finished. Instead, she stayed at the table, quietly sketching in a notebook while Edward returned to his work. It was a small moment, but it felt significant, a sign that she was beginning to let him in. As the days grew longer and the warmth of spring began to seep into the air, Edward decided it was time to give the girls something they'd never had before: a real vacation. He spent hours planning every detail, wanting it to be perfect. When he finally revealed the surprise, a trip to a nearby lake cabin, Rosie's excitement was immediate and infectious. Lila, as expected, was more reserved, but Edward could see the flicker of anticipation in her eyes. The drive to the cabin was filled with Rosie's endless chatter and occasional bursts of music from the car radio. Lila sat quietly in the back seat, staring out the window, but her expression was calm, even content. When they arrived, the girls were awestruck by the cabin, a charming, rustic retreat nestled among towering pine trees with a clear view of the sparkling lake. Over the next few days, Edward watched as both girls began to relax in ways he hadn't seen before. Rosie spent hours splashing in the shallow water, collecting rocks, and chasing butterflies. Lila took longer to warm up, but Edward noticed her sneaking glances at the bookshelves in the cabin's cozy living room. He encouraged her to pick one, and soon she was curled up by the fireplace, completely absorbed in a novel. Edward made it a point to balance the trip with activities for all of them. They went hiking on nearby trails, roasted marshmallows by the fire, and even tried fishing, though Rosie's loud exclamations scared away most of the fish. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the lake in hues of gold and pink, Edward suggested they write messages in bottles to send out onto the water. "It's like making a wish," Edward explained as they each wrote their notes. "Something you hope for, something you want to say to the world." Rosie was the first to finish, carefully folding her paper and slipping it into the bottle. "I wished for a puppy," she declared proudly. Lila hesitated over her note, her pencil hovering above the paper. Finally, she wrote something quickly and slipped the note into her bottle. Edward followed suit, and together they walked to the edge of the dock to release their bottles into the lake. The three of them watched as the bottles drifted out into the water, carried by the gentle current. "What did you wish for?" Rosie asked, looking up at Edward. He smiled, ruffling her hair. "That's a secret," Rosie giggled, but Lila stayed quiet, her gaze fixed on the lake. Edward didn't press her, knowing that whatever she had written was hers to share or keep private. That night, as the girls slept soundly in the cabin's cozy bedrooms, Edward sat by the fire, reflecting on how far they had all come. The journey hadn't been easy, and he knew there were still challenges ahead, but moments like these made it all worthwhile. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond his business or his success. He was building something real, something lasting. The final day of the trip brought a surprise Edward hadn't planned for. As they packed up to leave, Rosie tugged on his sleeve, holding something behind her back. "I found this," she said, revealing a small, carved wooden heart. It was simple but beautifully crafted, with the word family etched into the surface. Edward knelt down to her level, taking the heart in his hands. "Where did you find this?" "In the little shop by the lake," Rosie said. "I thought we could hang it in our new house, so it feels like home." Edward felt a lump form in his throat as he looked at the small piece of wood. "It's perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Rosie." Lila, standing nearby, watched the exchange silently. As they loaded into the car, she slid into the back seat and pulled out the book she'd been reading. It wasn't until they were halfway home that she spoke. "It was a good trip," she said quietly, almost as if she were speaking to herself. Edward glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his heart swelling. "I'm glad you think so." Lila didn't say anything else, but the faint smile on her face told Edward everything he needed to know. They were making progress, step by step, moment by moment, and for the first time, the road ahead felt full of promise. Back in Winter Hollow, life settled into a new rhythm. The trip to the lake cabin had left a mark on all of them, creating memories that felt like the beginnings of something steady and unbreakable. Edward sensed that the bond he was forming with Lila and Rosie had grown deeper, though it still required patience and care. Rosie's exuberance made her an open book, always eager to share her thoughts and feelings, but Lila's trust, while growing, remained a precious and fragile thing. One evening, Edward invited the girls to join him for dinner at a small Italian restaurant in town. The cozy space was a favorite among locals, with its checkered tablecloths, flickering candles, and the scent of garlic and fresh bread wafting through the air. Rosie, delighted by the outing, immediately began chatting with the waiter about her favorite foods, while Lila quietly perused the menu. As they waited for their meals, Edward turned to Lila. "How's school going?" he asked, keeping his tone casual. "It's fine," she replied, shrugging. "I'm doing okay in most things. History's hard, though." Edward smiled. "History was never my strong suit either. But if you ever need help, you know where to find me." Lila glanced up, her expression thoughtful. "You'd really help me? Even if it's boring?" "Of course," Edward said. "Boring or not, if it matters to you, it matters to me." She didn't respond immediately, but Edward saw the hint of a smile on her face as she returned to her menu. Moments like these, small as they were, gave him hope. Each one felt like another brick in the foundation they were building together. After dinner, they strolled through the town square, which was beginning to transition from its winter decor to early signs of spring. The twinkling lights remained, casting a soft glow over the cobblestone streets. Rosie skipped ahead, pointing out shop windows and giggling at her own reflections, while Edward and Lila walked side by side. "You know," Edward began after a stretch of silence, "I've been thinking about signing Rosie up for some art classes. She's got a real talent for drawing." Lila nodded. "She's always loved that stuff. Mom used to find little things for her to draw with, even when we didn't have much." Edward's chest tightened at the mention of Eleanor. "Your mom sounds like she was an amazing woman." "She was," Lila said softly. "She always found a way to make things better, even when they weren't." Edward hesitated, then asked gently, "What about you? Is there anything you'd like to do? Something you've always wanted to try?" Lila shrugged, but there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. "I don't know. I guess I've never thought about it." "Well," Edward said, "if you think of something, let me know. I'd like to make it happen." Lila looked at him then, her expression searching. "Why do you care so much? About us, I mean." Edward stopped walking, his gaze steady. "Because you're my family, Lila. Whether it's official or not, that's how I feel. I want to see you and Rosie happy. I want to give you the kind of life your mom would have wanted for you." Lila studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll think about it." That night, as Edward dropped them off at home, Rosie hugged him tightly before running inside, her excitement about the evening bubbling over. Lila lingered by the car, her hands in her pockets. "Thanks for dinner," she said, her tone sincere. "You're welcome," Edward replied. "I'll see you soon. Okay?" "Okay," she said, offering him a small but genuine smile before heading inside. The next morning, Edward received a call from the private investigator he'd hired months ago. The man had been thorough, digging deeper into Eleanor's life and the circumstances surrounding her untimely death. What he shared made Edward's heart ache even more. Eleanor had spent her final months fighting not just her illness but the system that seemed intent on keeping her from getting the help she needed. Despite her struggles, she had never let Lila or Rosie see her despair. She had fought to the very end to protect her girls. Among the investigators' findings was a piece of information that took Edward completely by surprise. Eleanor had left a letter, addressed to him, stored with a friend who had promised to deliver it if the opportunity ever arose. The friend, an older woman named Mrs. Callahan, still lived in Winter Hollow. Edward wasted no time arranging to meet her. Mrs. Callahan greeted Edward warmly at her modest home, a hint of sadness in her kind eyes as she handed him the letter. "Eleanor always hoped you'd find your way back here," she said. She believed in second chances. Edward's hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope. The letter was written in Eleanor's neat, flowing handwriting, the words a mixture of love and regret. "Edward, if you're reading this, it means you've found your way back to Winter Hollow. It means you've found Lila and Rosie. I always hoped you would, though I wasn't brave enough to reach out myself. I didn't want to disrupt your life, but I never stopped believing you were meant to be a part of theirs. Lila has your strength, your determination. Rosie has your kindness, even if she doesn't know it yet. They are the best parts of you and me, and I hope that one day you'll see that for yourself. If nothing else, know that I never stopped loving you, and I never stopped believing that, in some way, you'd come back to us. With all my heart, Eleanor." Tears blurred Edward's vision as he read the letter, her words wrapping around his heart like a lifeline. He felt the weight of everything he hadn't known, everything he had missed, but also a profound sense of gratitude. Eleanor had believed in him, even when he hadn't deserved it, and now he had the chance to honor her faith by being the man she had hoped he would become. That evening, Edward returned to Lila and Rosie's home, the letter carefully tucked into his pocket. He didn't share it with them yet, feeling that the time wasn't right, but its presence gave him a renewed sense of purpose. He spent the evening playing games with Rosie and helping Lila with her homework, small, ordinary moments that felt extraordinary in their simplicity. As he left that night, Lila called out to him just before he reached the door. "Edward." He turned, surprised to hear her use his name so directly. "Yes? Do you think we're going to be okay?" The vulnerability in her voice hit him hard, but he smiled, his answer steady and sure. "I know we will." For the first time, Lila didn't just nod or smile faintly. She stepped forward and hugged him, her arms tightening around him in a way that spoke of trust, hope, and something close to love. In that moment, Edward knew he was home. In the days following Lila's embrace, Edward found himself reflecting more deeply on how far they had come as a family. It wasn't just the small gestures or the moments of shared laughter. It was the growing sense of belonging that tethered them together. Every visit, every conversation, every small victory felt like another thread weaving a tapestry of connection. He knew it wasn't perfect. There were still shadows of doubt in Lila's eyes sometimes, and Rosie occasionally asked questions about their past that neither Edward nor Lila had easy answers for. But it was progress, and that was enough. One afternoon, Edward decided it was time to take another step forward. He had been quietly working with his lawyer to formalize his intentions to legally become Lila and Rosie's guardian. Though the process would take time, he wanted to be upfront with Lila about his plans. He understood the delicate balance required. This wasn't something he could rush or assume she would accept without hesitation. But he also knew that honesty was critical to building their trust. He invited them to his house for dinner, taking special care to prepare their favorite dishes: spaghetti with marinara for Rosie and chicken parmesan for Lila. When they arrived, Rosie immediately darted off to explore the house, her boundless energy filling the space with life. Lila, as always, was more measured, hanging back slightly as Edward greeted her at the door. "Something smells good," she said, her tone casual but curious. "I thought it was time for a proper family dinner," Edward said with a warm smile. "Hope you're hungry." As they sat around the table, the conversation flowed easily at first. Rosie regaled them with stories about her art projects at school, her hands gesturing wildly as she described her latest masterpiece. Lila listened with a small, fond smile, occasionally chiming in with a teasing comment that made Rosie giggle. Edward watched them both, his heart swelling with pride and affection. After dinner, as Rosie wandered off to explore again, Edward turned to Lila. "I wanted to talk to you about something," he said, his tone calm but serious. Lila looked up from her plate, her expression wary but attentive. "What is it?" Edward took a breath, carefully choosing his words. "I've been thinking a lot about the future, about what it means to be part of your lives, and to make sure you and Rosie have the stability you deserve." She didn't say anything, but her posture stiffened slightly, her eyes narrowing as if bracing for bad news. "I've started the process to become your legal guardian," Edward continued gently. "It's not something I'm doing lightly, and I want you to know that it's not about taking anything away from you or your mom. It's about making sure that you and Rosie are safe and supported, no matter what." Lila's fork hovered over her plate, her brow furrowing. "What does that mean? Like adoption?" "Eventually, yes," Edward said. "But right now, it's just the first steps. And I want you to know that nothing will happen without your input. This isn't just my decision. It's yours too." Lila stared at him for a long moment, her face unreadable. Finally, she set down her fork and leaned back in her chair. "Why now?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with uncertainty. "Why do you care so much after all this time?" Edward met her gaze, his own steady and filled with sincerity. "Because I made a mistake leaving Winter Hollow all those years ago. I didn't know about you or Rosie, but I should have been there for your mom. I can't change the past, Lila, but but I can do everything in my power to make the future better. For all of us." She didn't respond immediately, and Edward could see the wheels turning in her mind. She was weighing his words, testing their truth against the reality she had lived for so long. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter now. "Rosie doesn't understand all this yet. She just sees you as the nice guy who buys her pancakes and plays games with her. But for me, it's harder." "I understand," Edward said gently, "and I'm not asking you to decide anything right now. Take all the time you need. Just know that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Lila nodded slowly, her expression softening. "Okay." The moment felt like a turning point, fragile yet filled with possibility. Edward knew there were still barriers to overcome, but her willingness to listen, to consider his words, was more than he could have hoped for. As the evening wound down, Edward brought out a small box from the living room and handed it to Lila. "I found something I thought you might like," he said. She opened the box carefully, revealing a framed photo of Eleanor holding a young Lila. The photo was one Edward had found among Eleanor's belongings, restored and placed in a delicate silver frame. Lila's eyes widened, and she reached out to touch the photo, her fingers grazing the glass. "I remember this," she whispered. "It was Christmas. Mom made cookies, and we stayed up late watching movies." Edward smiled, his voice soft. "Your mom was amazing. She gave you and Rosie so much love. I hope I can honor that." Lila nodded, her eyes misty but bright. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. As they prepared to leave that night, Edward hugged Rosie tightly, her giggles filling the air as she wrapped her arms around his neck. Lila lingered by the door, holding the photo close to her chest. "You really mean it, don't you?" she asked, her voice tentative but steady. "I do," Edward said. "With all my heart." She looked at him for a moment longer, then gave him a small, genuine smile. "Good." As Edward watched them walk down the path to their apartment, the weight of the moment settled over him. He knew the road ahead would still have its challenges, but for the first time, he felt a true sense of hope. They were becoming a family, slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably, and that was more than he had ever dreamed possible. Spring gave way to summer in Winter Hollow, and with it came a new sense of normalcy for Edward, Lila, and Rosie. The transition wasn't without its bumps. Lila had moments where her walls would go back up, and Rosie occasionally voiced confusion about why things had changed so much. But Edward remained steadfast, meeting each challenge with patience and love. He knew they were still navigating the uncharted waters of becoming a family, and he was determined to prove that he was in it for the long haul. One warm evening, Edward decided to host a barbecue at his house. It was a small gathering, just a few close neighbors and friends Edward had made in the community since returning to Winter Hollow. He wanted to give Lila and Rosie a chance to feel connected to the town, to see that they were surrounded by people who cared about them. The girls had been hesitant at first, but Rosie's excitement won out, and Lila, ever the protector, agreed to come along to keep an eye on her sister. The backyard was alive with the sounds of laughter and the sizzle of food on the grill. Rosie was running through the grass with a group of neighborhood kids, her giggles ringing out as they played tag. Lila stood on the porch, watching with a careful eye, but there was a lightness to her posture that Edward hadn't seen before. She seemed more at ease, more willing to let her guard down. Edward walked over, holding 2 glasses of lemonade. He handed one to Lila and leaned against the porch railing. "Rosie looks like she's having the time of her life," he said. Lila nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "She's never had anything like this before." "Well, she deserves it," Edward said. "So do you." She glanced at him, her smile fading slightly. "It's weird," she admitted. "Being here, doing all this. It doesn't feel real sometimes." Edward met her gaze, his voice steady. "It's real, Lila, and it's not going anywhere." She looked away, her expression thoughtful. "I guess I'm still getting used to it." "That's okay," Edward said. "Take all the time you need." Later that evening, as the sun began to set and the fireflies emerged, Edward gathered everyone around for dessert. He had set up a small fire pit in the yard, and the group toasted marshmallows while Rosie happily smeared chocolate on her face as she made s'mores. Lila sat quietly by the fire, watching the flames dance, but Edward could see a hint of contentment in her eyes. As the gathering wound down and the guests began to leave, Edward noticed Lila lingering by the fire pit. He walked over and sat beside her, the crackling of the flames filling the silence between them. "Thanks for doing this," she said after a while. "For Rosie." "For both of you," Edward replied. She hesitated, then said, "I think she's starting to think of you as, like a dad." Edward's chest tightened at her words, but he kept his tone calm. "And what about you?" Lila didn't answer right away. She stared into the fire, her expression pensive. "It's hard," she admitted. "I don't know how to let myself trust it." "Trust you?" Edward nodded, his voice gentle. "I understand, and I'm not going to rush you. I'll be here, no matter how long it takes." She looked at him then, her eyes searching his face. "Why? Why do you care so much?" "Because I see how strong you are," Edward said. "How much you've done to take care of Rosie, how much you've sacrificed. And because I care about you, Lila, both of you. I want to be the person you can count on." Her eyes glistened, and she quickly wiped at them with the back of her hand. "I don't want to lose anyone else," she whispered. "You won't," Edward said firmly. "I promise." For the first time, Lila didn't argue. She didn't smile, but there was a flicker of something in her expression. Acceptance, maybe, or the first steps toward trust. As the summer days rolled on, Edward began to see more of that trust in small but significant ways. Lila started sharing more about her hopes and dreams, things she had never allowed herself to believe could happen. She talked about wanting to become a writer, how she loved creating stories and imagined one day seeing her name on the cover of a book. Edward encouraged her, even buying her a notebook and pen set to help her get started. Rosie, meanwhile, continued to blossom. She thrived in her art classes, filling the house with drawings and paintings that Edward proudly displayed on the walls. She grew more confident, her bubbly personality shining brighter with each passing day. By the time autumn arrived, Edward felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The process to become the girl's legal guardian had moved forward smoothly, and while the paperwork wasn't yet final, the three of them were already living like a family. They celebrated Rosie's 7th birthday with a party at the local park, complete with balloons, cake, and all her favorite friends. Lila had even helped plan the day, her quiet involvement a testament to how far she had come. One evening, as they sat together on the couch watching a movie, Rosie climbed onto Edward's lap, her small arms wrapping around his neck. "I love you, Edward," she said sleepily, her head resting on his shoulder. Edward's throat tightened, and he kissed the top of her head. "I love you too, Rosie." He glanced over at Lila, who was curled up in the corner of the couch with her notebook. She caught his eye and gave him a small smile, the kind that carried more weight than words ever could. In that moment, Edward realized that everything he had been working toward, every effort, every challenge, every step, had been worth it. They weren't perfect, and they still had a long way to go, but they were a family. And for the first time in a long time, Edward felt like he had found his true purpose. As the credits rolled and the house fell quiet, Edward sat in the glow of the TV, holding Rosie close and glancing at Lila, who had fallen asleep with her notebook still in her lap. The world outside might have been unpredictable and chaotic, but here, in this small, quiet corner of Winter Hollow, there was love, there was hope, and there was the unshakable promise of a brighter future.